In the name of the eternal, merciful, compassionate, and gracious Elohim, long-suffering, slow to anger, and abundant in goodness and truth, rich in steadfast kindness, extending kindness to the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. I bear witness that there is only one eternal Elohim in whom we move, live, and have our being. The eternal Elohim who will bring Israel back out of captivity and have compassion on Israel, and will gain and gather Israel from all the nations where the eternal Elohim has scattered Israel. Holy greetings in the name of the only wise Elohim of the universe, creator of the heavens and of the earth. Greetings in the name of the Elohim of heaven, the Elohim of Abraham, of Yitzchak, and Jacob. Heaven and earth bear witness to the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart, that there is no Elohim but the eternal, and that the Honorable Chief Rabbi Wentworth Arthur Matthew of blessed memory, the messenger, who in 1919 founded Commandment Keepers Ethiopian Hebrew Congregation of the Living God, Pillar and Ground of the Truth, also known as Commandment Keepers Ethiopian Hebrew Congregation, Beth Hatifala Headquarters, also known by many other names, collectively Commandment Keepers, one entity and not two entities. On this beautiful day at the synagogue located at 225 East Kinney Street, Newark, New Jersey, we greet you in Hebrew, the ancient tongue of our ancestors. Shalom Aleichem. Peace be unto you. Yihiyu l'razonim refivi helom, libi lefaneka Adonai zoribi go'ali. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable before thee, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. This oral history project is our story presented in our own words through a series of video presentations. In order to give an accurate account and clarify factual inaccuracies and to separate facts from opinions reported in articles, letters, internet interviews, and other media sources, we have to make sure that the facts speak for themselves, as history shows that over 2,000 years after the Exodus from Egypt, the psychological and behavioral motivations of rebellion found in Sidra Korah still exists and leads the way in the events that unfolded in the 20th and 21st centuries of one of the oldest Israelite congregations in America and the Western Hemisphere. Commandment Keepers, founded in 1919, was also embroiled in unrest in 1977. Unrest that was brought on by a rebellion that continued into the 80s, 90s, and 21st century. We let the record speak in our Video 5 presentation by making distinct parallels in an ancient theme of rebellion and divisiveness with ancient roots in the Torah portion, Sidra Korah. And pertinent to this presentation is the 1977 Supreme Court New York County secular court case. We will be using narratives, statements of law, and statements of ethics from the Torah hereinafter biblical law, along with the 1977 civil court proceeding and its July 11, 1979 stipulation of discontinuance hereinafter secular law, commenced by David Matthew Doré, plaintiff, the grandson of the late Honorable Chief Rabbi W.A. Matthew of blessed memory, hereinafter Doré, against Rabbi Chaim White, Rabbi Jonah McCullough, and Rabbi David Lee, defendants of blessed memory, hereinafter elders in the Supreme Court, New York County, Special Term Part 1 secular case under index number 22801-77. This is a secular action by Doré for an injunction, for damages, and for restoration to the post of spiritual leader of Commandment Keepers Congregation. Please note that restoration is a factual inaccuracy, as Doré was never the sole spiritual leader of Commandment Keepers. This secular case has set forth a ripple effect, initiating similar cases of rebellion in the 80s, 90s, and Doré once again led the ultimate rebellion when he breaks into the synagogue building on Friday, January 2nd, 2004, in the 21st century. Why does the Torah not say God saw that it was good on the second day of creation, as it says in all other days? Because on that day, divisiveness was created. As it is written in Genesis, Bereshit 1:6, let there be a firmament within the waters, and it shall divide between water and water. Divisiveness has its roots in the ego's quest for authority. A classic example of divisiveness is demonstrated by Korah, who was the leader of a rebellion against Moshe and his brother Aharon during the journey of the Israelites from Egypt to the land of Israel. As punishment, Korah met his end by miraculously being swallowed up by the earth. His story is told in the book of Numbers, hereinafter Bamidbar, in the Torah portion known as Korah, found in Bamidbar chapter 16, verse 1 through 18:32. Korah envied Moshe and Aharon, and also his cousin Al-Safan, who had been put in charge of the Levites after Aharon's family had become elevated to the rank of Kohanim or priests. Video presentation 5 is appropriately entitled The Spirit of Korah, Rebellion and the Lack of Accountability, because it bespeaks of an upheaval and a misguided claim by Doré to be sole spiritual leader and commandment keepers without any formal or legal precedents to claim that right as his own by commencing a civil action against the elders who were representative of commandment keepers' spiritual leadership. The record will also show that Doré lacked accountability for his own actions against the elders and instead blames the elders for his own shortcomings. From the outset, we asked the question, what provoked Korah, and similarly Doré's rebellion? Sidra Korah indicates that Korah, the son of Issachar, along with 250 respected leaders of the Israelite camp, chiefs of the Sanhedrin, whose roles can be likened to the secular New York Supreme Court judges, who despite their roles in the community of Israel, rebelled against Moshe and Aharon. Korah and the 1977 Supreme Court secular case will serve as background resources as well as points to a central theme of rebellion and divisiveness. There are at least 3 types of actions that paralleled the ancient and modern rebellions that were expressed by both Korah and Doré alike, namely 1, Kina meaning jealousy and envy, 2, Ta'ava meaning desire for more and more, and 3, Kavod meaning striving for honor and recognition. In particular, the secular court case record will show how Commandment Keepers' congregational split originated out of the spirit of Korah, expressed through Doré's actions of rising up against the elders. This spirit is behind many of the attacks expressed through feelings of jealousy, envy, and a negative attitude that Korah in ancient times held regarding the leadership of the children of Israel, echoes similar characteristics of jealousy, envy, and negative attitude that manifested within Commandment Keepers in 1977. Subsequently, 4 years after the death of the Honorable Chief Rabbi W.A. Matthew in 1973, God's people cannot substitute unclean offerings for clean offerings and give them to God. God's people cannot declare good what God declared is evil. God's people must never think that we can without consequence wander after things we are told to reject, because the result at some point can be that God will no longer block our path for our own good. Scripture says in Bamidbar chapter 16:1, and Korah separated himself, which shows that Korah immediately began his rebellion against Moshe and Aharon after God commanded Moshe to speak unto the children of Israel. Bid them that they make throughout their generations fringes, the word in Hebrew hereinafter zizi, and that they put with the zizi of each corner a thread of blue. However, the main cause of Korah's revolt was the nomination of Elisaphan, son of Uziel, as prince over the Kohathites. But Korah gained momentum for his rebellion by highlighting the commandment of Zizi in Bamidbar chapter 15, verses 37 through 40, a commandment Korah used to persuade like-minded high-ranking Israelites, men of renowned distinction, and persuaded them that their cause was right. So Korah separated himself from the commandment of Zizi, thereby demonstrating an element of separation, which further showed Korah and his co-conspirators were filled with ta'avah, a desire for more and more. Thus, when scripture says, and Korah separated himself, it alludes to separation on deeper levels from God's commandment when Korah incited all the people against Moshe, arguing that it was impossible to endure the laws of Moshe had instituted, and asked Moshe why that unbearable law of Zizi had been imposed on them. Bamidbar 15:39 says that ye may look upon it and remember all the commandments of the Lord. So what does Korah do? Korah separates himself from the community of Israel and gathered together his like-minded co-conspirators, then forcefully attacked Moshe's authority by means of an argument. Does a four-corner garment made entirely of blue wool require zizi, or is it exempt? What Korah really was after was complete control of all Israel. To that end, Korah's point was that Moshe's Torah made no sense and was Moshe's own invention. Korah's thoughts separated him from God. Bamidbar 16:11 says, therefore, thou and all thy company that are gathered together against the Lord. Bamidbar 16:21 says, separate yourselves from among this congregation, that I may consume them in a moment. Bamidbar 16:30 then says, then ye shall understand that these men have despised, separated from the Lord. The rebellion of Korah demonstrates the grim consequences of usurping the authority of God and of those whom he has chosen to be leaders of his people. Therefore, God will make it known which ones he will choose as priests and their helpers. As in Bamidbar 17:20, it states, and it shall come to pass that the man whom I shall choose, his rod shall bud. Similarly, Doré, who separated himself from the congregation, had come under the power of resentment, which grew and festered until he rose up against the elders, gathered together others of like mind, and forcefully accused the spiritual leadership of wrongdoings by challenging the elders' authority, elders who were representative of God's commandments in the house of Commandment Keepers, and in the spirit of Korah, and in an open rebellion, just like Korah, received consequences of usurping the authority of God, and just like Korah overstepped God's boundaries by ignoring that God ultimately chooses the spiritual leader of his people. The 1977 court case shows facts as our primary source and not hearsay on how Doré commenced his civil action under index number 22801-77 for a preliminary injunction to compel the elders of Commandment Keepers to permit him to use the rabbi's study. Ironically, after Doré's 1977 Supreme Court action was discontinued by the July 11, 1979 stipulation of discontinuance, the record will further show Doré intentionally or unintentionally continued to promote his rebellious campaign regarding the spiritual leadership at Commandment Keepers in 1977 and throughout the 80s, 90s, and into the 21st century. In comparison, Korah's rebellion continues with Bamidbar 16:3. We are here because we believe that you are taking on too much power for one man, Korah answered. You and your priests act as though you are holier than any of the rest of us. If we are God's chosen people, then all of us are holy. Essentially, that means that all of us have equal rights in the matters of Moshe's government. Korah's rebellion didn't exist without the participation from others. There were three visible elements in Korah's major challenge of Moshe's authority. One, Korah himself a Levite, and a part of that group assigned to guard and transport the most sacred portions of the sanctuary, who was among those overlooked for the priesthood and who were relegated to being mere assistants to the priest, was not satisfied with his status and desired also a share of the priesthood, even the high priesthood, and moved through ambition and jealousy to seize it contrary to the express commandment of God. Similarly, Doré thought himself, quote, ordained me at that age, recognizing that I had unique educational qualifications to assist his grandfather at this renowned synagogue, end quote. 2. Dathan and Abiram and On were Reubenites. Their ancestor Reuben, the firstborn of Jacob, were men who had their own grudge. Since Reuben had lost his birthright as the firstborn son to the sons of Joseph, having been deprived of the right of succession belonging to the firstborn child, thus losing the leadership of Israel, and many have supposed that the participation of some of Reuben's descendants in this rebellion led by Korah was due to their hope of recovering some of the lost prerogatives of Reuben, especially as it pertained to the leadership of Israel. Similarly, the rebels, who along with Doré rebelled against the elders of Commandment Keepers and thought themselves to be lifetime members and having an entitlement to leadership as it pertained to Commandment Keepers. 3. Then there were 250 princes from all of the 12 tribes. They also apparently were moved by a number of motives. Similarly, those rebels acting as co-conspirators along with Doré also had a number of motives. One instance being that the 250 princes had just been passed over in previous enumerations of the leaders of the tribes and were perhaps jealous. What do we see here? Resentment leads to bitterness, which then leads to separation, then to uprising, then to accusation, then to rebellion against God's ordained authority, then to attempted usurpation of power and authority, and eventually it leads to God's judgment. In retrospect, in considering the past history or past events that unfolded in Commandment Keepers during the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 21st century, those rebels who participated in Doré's 1977 rebellion continued to fight within Commandment Keepers for over 30 years due to resentment, bitterness, jealousy, separation, uprising, then accusation, then to rebellion, and a fight against the elders over their authority and spiritual leadership. Yet, their community always finds occasion to complain, disapprove, and ultimately reject spiritual leaders, no matter who they are. And the argument continued saying, you use your authority to put men who are your friends in the best position in Moshe's government. God had in fact expressed to Moshe right before the revelation at Mount Sinai, you, the entire people, shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Exodus, hereinafter Shemot, chapter 19:6. Similarly, Doré, at the root of his 1977 secular court case, challenges the elders in their roles as spiritual leaders and places himself above God's congregation, as Doré stated, quote, an action for restoration to the post of spiritual leader of Commandment Keepers, end quote. The use of the word restoration is a factual inaccuracy because Doré was never, quote, legally duly ordained rabbi and spiritual leader and member of the trustee board, as alleged by Doré in his April 15, 1981 letter to the congregation members and trustees, end quote. Korah and Doré alike disguised themselves, cloaking evil in piety, showing their motivations to project selfish, egotistical, and aggressive intentions in the guise of good and decent. Doré separated himself from the congregation, sought out other like-minded rebels, and then rose up in defiance and accusation against the spiritual leadership. The Torah is replete with reminders that God is in charge, as Scripture says in Deuteronomy, hereinafter Devarim, chapter 4:39, "Know this day, and lay it to thy heart that the Lord, He is God in heaven above, and upon the earth beneath, there is none else." Devarim 5:6 further states, "I am the Lord thy God," and continues by saying, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." The ultimate expression is found in our daily declaration of our faith, wherein we, the children of Israel, are reminded in Devarim 6:4, "Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad." Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, which demonstrates that Israel has a special relationship with God, because the covenant that God gave at Mount Sinai reinforced the covenant that God had given to Abraham. Therefore, the children of Israel are reminded to observe all of God's commandments and to be holy, vehe yatim kedoshim, to God in matters of disputes. Korah's thoughts about complete control of all Israel manifested into his actions against Moshe and Aharon. Similarly, Doré's thoughts of complete control of Commandment Keepers manifested into civil action and subsequent rebellions against the elders. Therefore, we can see that holiness is not given to the children of Israel. It's an ambition to strive for through observance of all the commandments. As Scripture states, the community is holy. When Korah argues that the nation is holy, he undermines the wisdom of the Torah. In comparison, Doré, even after his 1977 civil action was discontinued, continued his rebellion by writing a letter to the congregation on April 15, 1981, wherein he wrote, quote, "I, Rabbi David Matthew Doré, herewith declare that I am still the legally duly ordained rabbi and spiritual leader," end quote. Both Korah in his challenge to Moshe and Aaron's leadership and Doré in his challenge against the elders' spiritual leadership is an expression of self-sufficiency that must be seen as idolatry in its purest form. At the root of this rebellion is a rebellion against the Torah that God gave to the children of Israel. Korah and Doré both showed that they had undermined their human responsibility for the congregation of Israel, and through actions similarly showed their lack of accountability for their disruption in the fixed order of things within the community of Israel. Obviously, Korah and Doré both thought that they could do a better job leading the people than Moshe, Aharon, or in Doré's case, the elders. In comparison, both Korah and Doré, through their actions, actually rebelled against God. As Bamidbar 16:11 says, "Therefore thou and all thy company that are gathered together against the Lord." More importantly, the true leaders of the congregation are called by God to their office through a process. In Doré's case, a modern-day process of election governed by a board, instituted by the late Honorable Chief Rabbi Matthew, who were under the faith and guidance of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So those who are considered to be false spiritual leaders are not called on by God, and on the other hand are considered to be wolves in sheep's clothing. The 1977 secular court case led to elitism, discord, disagreement, and divisiveness in the form of a rebellion that incapacitated and divided Commandment Keepers congregation during the 20th and early 21st centuries. The prophet Jeremiah states in Lamentations, chapter 3, verse 38, "From the mouth of the Most High, neither evil nor good come forth, since free choice is in our hands, and our own decision is what prompts us to commit all those wrongs. Accordingly, sinners themselves cause their own loss. Free choice in their behavior and in their direct actions to rebel against God is symbolic of both Korah and Doreh's loss. Both Korah and Doreh may plot out their steps, and many designs were in their minds, but it is God's plan that is accomplished. Spiritual leadership requires public respect. Spiritual leadership that is mocked or denigrated cannot be effective. Even members of the ancient Sanhedrin were capable of erring. But it is nonetheless a principle of Israelite thought that those most imbued with Torah knowledge and who have internalized a large degree of the perfection of values and refinement of character that the Torah idolizes are thereby rendered most qualified to offer an authentic Israelite perspective on matters of import to Israelites. Torah teachings are clear. You should rise before the elderly and honor the aged. Leviticus Vayikra, chapter 19:32. Why? The Hebrew word for elderly is zaken, which is an acronym for Zeh, Shekinah, Hakmah, a person who has acquired wisdom. According to the Jewish Virtual Library, it states, in Israel, as among other ancient peoples, the elder is not only a person of advanced age, but also a man of distinct social grade. The elders were the consulting body of the city, the nation, or the king respectively, and as such were considered the wise. As a social institution, various types of elders are named: elders of people, elders of an area, elders of the diaspora, elders of the priests, elders of a tribe, elders of the city, and elders of the house. The most prominent are the elders of the people or the country and the elders of the city. Their functions are best exemplified by the pertinent laws of Devarim. The city elders are involved in 5 laws, of which 2 of the 5 laws is 1, that of the rebellious son, found in Devarim chapter 21, verse 19, and 2, Levirate service, found in Devarim 25:9. Devarim chapter 21, verses 18 and 19 says, if a man have a stubborn and rebellious son, then shall his father and his mother lay hold on him and bring him out unto the elders of his city. Accordingly, Doreh was ordained at the same time with elders Chaim White and Jonah McCullough, who were elders of the congregation. Elders who under these conditions had the capacity to guide the young and the stubborn and rebellious Doreh. According to Shemot 18, it was Yethro who advised Moshe to establish a judicial social organ in order to help him judge the people. The Lord draws from some of the spirit of Moshe and instills it in the 70 elders who are to assist him. Moshe himself proposes that he pick men from the tribes in order to create the judicial body. These 3 traditions present different outlooks on the quality of the elder judge in ancient Israel. In Shemot 18, the attributes of the chosen men are fear of God, trustworthiness, and honesty. In Bamidbar 11, it is the Spirit of God, divine inspiration, which makes a man a member of the elders' council. The functions of the elders of the people is not limited to 2, but for our oral presentation 5, we highlight 2 functions. 1, to represent the people in the covenant and in the proclamation of the law, and 2, to perform sacred ceremonies. Participation in the assembly of the elders was considered a great honor. Proverbs chapter 31, verse 23. Qualifications for spiritual leadership is much more complicated. Gadlut Torah, or Torah greatness, necessitates an all-embracing, fully accountable handling of serious issues facing the congregation, including the attitude towards the congregation in all its diversity in various levels, both religious and non-religious, the attitude towards commandments, the attitude towards science and work, and the contemporary social and economic questions. Expertise in Torah does not even necessarily make one wise. Dore's education gave him a false sense of power and entitlement, and was acted out in inappropriate ways. The challenge of education is to use it for the betterment of the community and to avoid using it as a prop for one's ego. That was Korah's, and similarly is Dore's fatal mistake. Dore's education caused him to rebel and litigate against his elders. So what was Dore lacking that caused him to rebel against the elders? We can look at three causes. One, when the 1971 ordination of elders White and McCullough in Dore was recognized by the congregation, Dore misconstrued the ordination and his education to mean that he was the natural sole spiritual leader of Commandment Keepers based on what Dore believed to be, quote, unique educational qualifications, end quote, and not based on the Constitution and bylaws of Commandment Keepers that the late Honorable Chief Rabbi Matthew instituted. So the elders in their role of spiritual leadership caused Dore to seethe. Dore questioned the elders' integrity, authority, educational qualification, and accused, quote, Rabbi White and others in wrestling control to become the sole spiritual leader of the congregation, end quote. 2, to inaugurate the elders into service, there was a process which included Article 11, a majority vote of the board, and Article 19 of the congregation's constitution as instituted by the late Chief Rabbi Matthews. This represented their being spiritually lifted to new levels in the congregation. This set off Dore's hatred of the elders and led Dore down the path of his first rebellion by commencing his secular civil court litigation. And 3, since Dore was ordained along with 2 elders, he was unrecognizable until he emphasized his age and said, quote, my ordination occurred at the age of 16, end quote. In 1977, both elders, Rabbis Chaim White and Jonah McCullough, acted as communal leaders. One person did not do it all. They themselves fulfilled the commandment of, and I dwell amongst my people. They were accepted by Commandment Keepers congregation in their role as spiritual leaders. It was their connection to the community which provided them with their authority. Dore in 1977 dishonored the elders due to his perception of legal authority and commencing his secular civil action against them. The elders were integrated and deeply rooted in the congregation. Dore in his youth lacked da'at, knowledge, and detached himself intentionally and or unintentionally from the congregation by concentrating on his need to be the sole spiritual leader. As is well known, one of the Torah's commandments is loving God. You shall love God, your Lord, with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. So the job of a spiritual leader is to bring others to the love of God. Dore's rebellion in the form of his litigation against the elders and had detracted from bringing the congregation to the love of God. And thus God's name became hated instead of loved because of litigation, and the role of the sole spiritual leader demonstrated by Dore in his 1977 civil litigation action against the elders. The Torah is a Torah of life. It is our life and the length of our days. And in it we shall meditate day and night, a concept that requires that we expend the greatest of efforts to remove any conflicts between spiritual leadership. Therefore, there is a vital need for da'at, knowledge. Those who involve themselves in Torah study are supposed to demonstrate through their actions and to clarify that its values do not cause hate, but rather bring love and completion to both the individual and the congregation. The Torah world is a world that knows how to discuss conflicts and is deeply fixed in responsibility, in sensitivity, and in humanity, with all that this implies in all areas of life. What we have in the spirit of Korah is the inability to discern right and wrong and spiritual leadership. Doré embodies that inability to discern right and wrong and thereby embodies the spirit of Korah. Moshe spoke to Korah privately and warned him against his lust for personal honor. Moshe said, Bamidbar, chapter 16:9, is it not enough that the God of Israel has distinguished you from the congregation of Israel to draw you near to him, to perform the service in the tabernacle of the Lord, and to stand before the congregation to minister to them? But his words fell on deaf ears. Similarly, Doré, in his lust for personal honor and his lust to be the sole spiritual leader of Commandment Keepers, began rebelling and started his fight in the Supreme Court, New York County, Special Term Part 1, against elders Rabbi Chaim White, Rabbi Jonah McCullough, and Gabbai David Lee, under index number 22801-77. Yet, despite Doré's action, God exposed the weakness of Doré's rebellion by not granting him spiritual leadership or the use of the rabbi's office. Instead, Doré, in his secular case, did not clearly show that he would succeed on the merits or that he would suffer irreparable harm in the absence of injunctive relief. Even the May 12, 1978 decision rendered by Justice Irving Kirschenbaum, a justice of the Supreme Court of the State of New York, Doré met opposition to his claim when Justice Kirschenbaum outlined the procedure for attaining the status of spiritual leader of Commandment Keepers congregation, which was spelled out clearly with specific reference to Articles 11 and 19 of the congregation's constitution. Moreover, the May 12, 1978 Judge Kirschenbaum decision demonstrated that Doré failed to comply with the Articles of the Constitution of Commandment Keepers and failed to comply with any of the rules or regulations concerning attainment of the status of the spiritual leader. Essentially, papers on file in the Supreme Court indicated facts contrary to Doré's statements in his April 15, 1981 letter to the congregation, wherein Doré stated, quote, I, Rabbi David Doré, herewith declare that I am still the legally duly ordained spiritual leader of the Ethiopian Hebrew congregation, end quote. Doré commenced an action for injunctive relief and for declaration of his status. Yet after considerable aggravation, time, and expense to the trustees of the congregation, Doré's attorneys voluntarily dropped his action as evidenced by the July 11, 1979 stipulation of discontinuance, a mutual agreement that Doré and the elders signed on July 11, 1979. The July 11, 1979 stipulation of discontinuance is simply a piece of paper that mainly says that Doré agreed to discontinue his lawsuit. Signing the document finalized the lawsuit. Thus, the authority of the elders' spiritual leadership was openly proved and recognized by the congregation. Doré's rebellion against the elders failed. So even though Doré fought against the elders, he had not prevented the elders' collective efforts in maintaining the synagogue building and keeping the synagogue building in the hands of the congregation for more than 30 years. The synagogue building that Rabbis White, McCullough, and Gabbai David Lee had performed the great deed of resolving the foreclosure action. Doré tried to create an artificial differentiation between the congregation's constitution and bylaws, but failed to do so in his 1977 attack against the elders. Doré launched into a major attack on the elders with allegations of wrestling control. Doré then turned to the congregation and claimed to represent the congregation, yet his claim to sole spiritual leadership was unsuccessful. As a result of Doré's rebellion, the elders proclaimed that Doré and his followers could face a choice. They can either recant or they can accept the elders' spiritual leadership in all its aspects. Doré and his followers chose not to accept, therefore the congregation has paid a stiff price by being thrown into decades of unrest, uncertainty, and spiritual leadership challenges under chaos and civil unrest. Although Sidra Korah is ancient and belonging to the very distant past, the Sidra parallels Commandment Keepers' spirit of dispute, elitism, envy, discord, and disagreements spearheaded by Doré. The adjudication of the congregation's affairs to the secular court system under the Supreme Court, New York County, instead of through a bet din, caused considerable time, money, and aggravation. Accordingly, quote, whoever submits a suit for adjudication to non-Jewish judges is a wicked man. It is as though he rivaled, blasphemed, and rebelled against the Torah of Moshe, end quote. This quote, attributed to Rambam, is both succinct and sharp. Rabbi Jakta, in his text Gray Matter, Volume 2, quotes Rav Yuri Dasberg, who explains why the prohibition is so strident. Quote, a bet din demands of the litigants that they conduct themselves in an ethical manner above and beyond the strict letter of law. By contrast, a civil court judge has no mandate to demand more than a letter of the law. Thus, an Israelite who adjudicates in civil court, even if the court rules just as a bet din would have ruled, rejects the value system that we strive to integrate into our legal system, end quote. It is a fundamental belief in the Israelite community that Elohim gave the Israelite people the Torah at Mount Sinai, and that those holy laws govern every aspect of an Israelite's life, including the adjudicating of disputes. To adherents of that belief, litigating in civil court system constitutes a rejection of Torah law. Israelite law mandates that disputes between Israelites are to be resolved through the bet din. The term bet din means house of judgment and refers to a rabbinical court of justice that adjudicates disputes according to the principles set out in the Torah. However, there are some times when a litigant may litigate in a civil court. See Rabbi Yaakov, Fate, The Prohibition Against Going to Civil Courts, the Journal of the Bet Din of America, at page 1. In Justice Kirschenbaum's May 12, 1978 decision, he stated, quote, the court has jurisdiction over the affairs of a religious corporation, provided there is no interference with purely ecclesiastical matters. See Walker Memorial Baptist Church versus Sanders 285 NY 462-467. The court will adjudicate this motion in the context of interpreting the constitution of the congregation and not in the context of the religious doctrine. End quote. The civil secular lawsuit commenced by Doré never went to trial, as the May 12, 1978 court decision was only in effect pending a trial, and the July 11, 1979 stipulation of discontinuance made the May 12, 1978 court decision null and void, and any claims by Doré under the court decision was rendered null and void. Over 28 years ago, Doré did not clearly show that he would ultimately succeed on the merits. Unfortunately, Doré continued to insist on his status of sole spiritual leader. So in rebuttal to Doré's April 15, 1981 letter, an April 23, 1981 letter to Doré was sent from Michael Wolin, Esquire, managing partner of Julian Schlesinger, the attorney for the elders, that stated, quote, you are not legally the spiritual leader of the Ethiopian Hebrew congregation. In addition, papers on file in the Supreme Court indicate facts contrary to your statements. You commenced an action for injunctive relief and for a declaration of your status. As of the date of Judge Kirschenbaum's decision of May 12, 1978, you have failed to comply with the Articles of the Constitution of the Ethiopian Hebrew Congregation, and you have still failed to comply with any of the rules or regulations concerning attainment of the status of the spiritual leader. End quote. The record shows that the withdrawal of Dore's action and Dore's non-compliance with the congregation's constitution clearly showed that Dore, over 30 years ago, was never the sole spiritual leader of Commandment Keepers. Therefore, Dore was never granted unlimited use of the rabbi's office and study as alleged. Dore's alleged declaration as sole spiritual leader, use of the rabbi's office and study, was null and void and had no validity in the past or today. On July 23, 1978, Rabbi Chaim White was elected president of the board and rabbi in accordance with the Constitution's Articles 11 and 19, instituted by the late Honorable Chief Rabbi Matthew, and didn't wrestle control as alleged by Dore. Yet Dore, throughout his rebellion, never accepted responsibility for his own actions. Even after the July 11, 1979 stipulation of discontinuance was issued by the Supreme Court, Dore never stopped in his rebellion and has demonstrated a lack of accountability as the initiator and planter of bad and negative seeds against the congregation. Accordingly, Dore brought upon himself a deep inner desire to share his own strongly held views on his alleged position as sole spiritual leader. Dore's self-appointment is Dore's own account. Nothing exists within the archives, synagogue documentation, and or secular court records that supports his claim as sole spiritual leader. He was defeated in the July 23, 1978 election. He had one vote. It has been 43 years from his commencement of the 1977 action. Yet, he continued to cause considerable aggravation, time, and expense to Commandment Keepers, predicated on a 40-year-old court decision on May 12, 1978, that never granted him position as sole spiritual leader, nor gave him the use of the rabbi's office or study. The words, quote, and Korah took, raises another question as to what caused Korah to oppose Moshe. The sages answered that Korah took issue with Moshe because Moshe had, as Bamidbar Numbers chapter 3:30 states, appointed Elisaphan, the son of Uziel, as prince of the Kohathites. As Shemot 6:21 states, Korah decided to oppose Moshe and nullify everything that he did. Years later, in Dore's open letter to the world Hebrew community, hereinafter open letter, he stated, quote, my grandfather, Chief Rabbi W.A. Matthew, ordained me at that age, recognizing that I had the unique educational qualifications to assist my grandfather at this world-renowned synagogue, end quote. Dore was not ordained for the purpose of becoming the sole spiritual leader of Commandment Keepers. Rather, as he clearly stated in his own words in his open letter, quote, it was due to my mother's perseverance, sacrifice, and encouragement that I became a rabbi, end quote. Early on in Dore's youth, the seeds of succession and sole spiritual leadership had been planted in Dore's mind by his mother, notwithstanding the fact that the congregation was and still is governed by its constitution, which was instituted by the late Chief Rabbi Matthews. As a result, Dore, despite the congregation's constitution, sought succession as the sole spiritual leader of Commandment Keepers, as though it was his inheritance or birthright. When the congregation submitted its paperwork to become a religious corporation, any ideas about personal succession through inheritance or nepotism was taken away from Dore when the congregation found its governance under the New York Religious Corporation's laws, according to the late Honorable Chief Rabbi Matthew. Dore began his rebellious campaign in 1977 by disrupting peace within the congregation because he purportedly felt that he was the sole spiritual leader and couldn't use the rabbi's office, thereby having his personal rebellious campaign to to change the order fixed above and below. Doré and his supporters are just like Korah, who sought to change the order fixed. In this case, they sought to change the order fixed within Commandment Keepers. The sages said, "He who makes the right left and the left right, as it were, lays waste the world." Now Aaron represented the right and the Levites the left. And Korah sought to make the right and the left change places, and therefore he was punished. Further, the evil tongue was also found in Korah, and for that he was punished. R. Judah said, quote, "The left should always be embraced in the right," end quote. Seeking to change the order fixed above and below raises the question with the single word take. What did Korah take? The sages said he took an evil counsel for himself. If one runs after that which is not his, it flies from him. And what is more, he loses his own as well. So Korah pursued that which was not his, and he lost his own without obtaining the other. Doré and his group of supporters pursued time and time again through litigation and disruptive behavior in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 21st century, that which was not theirs: soul spiritual leadership, the use of the rabbi's office and study, and entry into Commandment Keepers synagogue building, those things that was not Doré's or his rebels. Moreover, Korah quarreled with peace, and he who quarrels with peace quarrels with the holy name. The Torah is also peace, as it is written, and all her paths are peace, Proverbs 3:17. Korah tried to upset peace on high and below, and therefore he was punished both on high and below. Korah's rebellion was a personal attack on Moshe and Aaron. The discord and disagreement caused by Korah's rebellion was so awful that it became the classic example for the sages of the worst kind of disagreement, an argument, quote, "not for the sake of heaven," end quote. And the opposite of this is, quote, "an argument for the sake of heaven," end quote. A final point to our video 5 presentation is found in the classic example given by the sages, the argument between Hillel and Shammai, Pirkei Avot 5:17. Every argument which is for the sake of heaven, the end is for the parties to that argument to endure, as in the argument between Beth Hillel and Beth Shammai, where none of the parties to the argument, the disciples, were lost, as opposed to Korah and his congregation, who were lost. Or the end, the desired end of the argument. In an argument for the sake of heaven, the desired end is to attain the truth. And this was attained in the argument between Beth Hillel and Beth Shammai, that the law is in accordance with Beth Hillel, and an argument which is not for the sake of heaven, the desired end, power and love of conquest, does not endure. And so we find in the argument of Korah and his congregation, their end was the attainment of glory and power, and the opposite of the sake of heaven was what transpired. Similarly, we find in the argument of Doré and his supporters, Hillel and Shammai's argument differ from Korah in that they argued out of a desire to discover the truth. Korah, on the other hand, argued for the sake of winning an argument. Sidra Korah parallels the 1977 secular civil court action commenced by Doré because Doré sought a declaration of his status as sole spiritual leader in the civil courts. Doré was fixated on that which was not his. Doré and his supporters argued for the sake of winning an argument. They were not seekers of truth. This becomes obvious when you notice the difference between what Korah, 250 chieftains, Dathan, and Abiram said and what they really wanted. What they said was that the people did not need leaders because they were all holy. They had all heard the word of Elohim. There should therefore be no leaders of higher rank or holiness within Israel. The same can be said about Doré and his supporters. Did they really care about the Honorable Chief Rabbi Wentworth Arthur Matthews' legacy, vision, honor, or congregation? Or was it all about the rabbi's office, study, and look at me, I am the sole leader, spiritual leader? If it was about the dignity of the legacy of the Honorable Chief Rabbi W.A. Matthew of blessed memory, Doré would not have commenced his action in 1977, nor continued his discord, disagreement, or elitism for more than 30 years. The lesson today is that in our time, we do not have a Moshe with such a direct line to God. Yet we do have humble elders who attempt to understand the godly directive and follow it. And as for Doré, unfortunately, we have many of those today. These are the ones who use ridicule to try to puncture the pure and altruistic motives of good people. They foster discontent. They clothe themselves in the guise of the populace. However, they are really out for themselves and their own ego. Quarreling within our community should be regarded as one of the gravest sins. Why? Because divisiveness contradicts the essential unity of God and undermines the harmony of creation. It was hatred, jealousy, and infighting which brought about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And only through unconditional love will it be rebuilt. The Torah states, don't be like Korah, Bamidbar 17:5. This is a prohibition against quarreling. Know your place and respect those who deserve it. This is the lesson of the rebellion of Korah translated into the rebellion of Doré. We should recognize God's hand when we see it. The religious life is about striving to create communities infused with holiness. By no means is this a given. Korah's challenge was not only ill-constructed, it was fatal for the religious program of the Torah. The commandment of Zizi, with its essential contrast between blue and white, reminds us that a formative moment in our relationship with God is the ability to make distinctions. It is the moment of making choices that we assume responsibility for the world. And it is through boundary making that we constructively respond to the aspirational call, Kedoshim Teheyu, you shall be holy because I, your God, am holy. Deuteronomy, Devarim 8:3 says, know that man does not live by bread alone, but by everything that proceedeth out of the mouth of the Lord doth man live. Devarim 10:12, and now Israel, what doth the Lord thy God require of thee? But to fear the Lord thy God, to walk in all his ways, and to love him, and to serve the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul. Devarim 11:13, and it shall come to pass, if ye shall hearken diligently unto my commandments, which I command you this day, to love the Lord your God and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul. Da'at, knowledge, has a beginning but no end. Da'at has knowledge, is power. If you are not willing to learn, no one can help you. If you are determined to learn, no one can stop you. This is Rabbinit Zadekin Yisrael Lewi, widow of Rabbi Zechariah Halevi ibn Abraham, of blessed memory, who in 2008 Jewish News article said, quote, we have a Jewish history that has not been written and published by our own communities. However, our immediate histories are from the Caribbean islands, the slave trade in West Africa, which can ultimately be traced back to North Africa, Yemen, and Ethiopia. In the meantime, let our deeds speak for themselves, end quote. Video presentation 5 is coming to you from Commandment Keepers in Newark, New Jersey. We welcome you to come and visit Commandment Keepers at 225 East Kinney Street, Newark, New Jersey, every Saturday morning at 9:30 a.m. Shalom, shalom, shalom.